All right. Hello, everyone. There's quite a few people there. I kind of miss seeing all the faces. I kind of like that, but um, no, I'm just looking at my presentation. So, welcome, everyone. Uh, I've been I've been with Caron for a good 10 years now, and prior to that, I was a anesthesiologist, mostly involved in the operating room work, open hearts for primarily babies and kids. And when I came into the field of addiction medicine, I've added to the knowledge that I already have, which wasn't much before I came into the field of addiction medicine. So today I'm going to share what we know as an organization at Caron, what we know today about addiction. And when I say addiction in this presentation, I'm talking about addiction to alcohol, addiction to substances. And this is not a new idea at all, especially with alcohol use. There had been physicians over the centuries, actually, who actually had a suspicion that, especially for alcoholism, that it's not simply someone who just liked to drink, sort of a town drunk. But even going as far back as in this country, goes as far back as the Revolutionary War, there was a physician, and those of you who are familiar with Pennsylvania or even Philadelphia, you'll know who he is, maybe. Benjamin Rush. Dr. Rush was a physician back in the Revolutionary War era, and he's actually one of our founding fathers too. His signature is on the Declaration of Independence. But Dr. Rush, for this country, was one of the very first physicians who had a suspicion that if those who used alcohol problematically, perhaps there's something more to it than just the person being a town drunk, right? That everyone shuns. And further down the road in this country, in the early 20th century, in the 1930s, there was another physician, Dr. Silkworth, William Silkworth. He was a psychiatrist, and he also, just like Dr. Rush, he suspected that, especially for alcoholism, there was much more to it than we understood at the time. And he took care of a lot of problematic alcohol users. Back in those days, the drunks. He took care of a lot of drunks, including a very famous one, Bill Wilson. And Bill Wilson's one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And what Dr. Silkworth was doing was he was trying to determine why some people cannot seem to stop drinking, even with the understanding that it is killing them, it is harmful. Dr. Silkworth didn't have the scientific data that we have today. He didn't have peer-reviewed studies. He didn't have bench studies. He didn't have fancy instrumentations that we have today, but he suspected that. And even if you read the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous, he contributed to the very beginning of the book called The Doctor's Opinion. In that chapter, Dr. Silkworth, this is what he said. He said, these men were not drinking to escape. They were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their mental control. Now, he didn't understand what might be behind that. It was just purely observational. But today, we have a pretty good idea of why that occurs. Why does a person seemingly cannot stop using alcohol? And then today, when we translate that to substances of all other kinds, it's the same mechanism. Next. And next. So to understand what addiction is, we have to, this is kind of a fun fact. In the old days, they have no understanding of what addiction is, the mechanism behind addiction. So they just kind of call it for what it is, just by what they see. And that's where, these terms demon rum came from, evil spirit, because when someone is intoxicated, their behavior changes, right? They're not the same person anymore. And this is true in all societies and in different parts of the world. And in China, there's a Chinese term for alcoholics. And I heard this as I was growing up. And basically, what it is if you translate the Chinese directly to English, what it means is alcohol ghost. Okay, so kind of like in this country when demon rum, that term was invented because the behavior changes and they're just not the same person that the family knows. They changed into someone completely different. And then later on in this country, without a full understanding of addiction, the solution was just don't do it. Don't drink, just say no. Well, that didn't work. And so as we gain more evidence into addiction and alcoholism, then the medical community start to recognize this as a disease. And so you can see there that alcoholism was first recognized by the AMA as a disease in 1956, and later down the road in 1987, drug addiction was recognized as a disease by the AMA. Next. So this is the industry standard of definition of addiction. This is from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. That's our society. Addictions are stress-induced, genetically mediated, primary chronic disease of the brain, reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. This is in 3 parts, as you notice here. The second part is dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. And then the last part is this is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and or relief by substance use and other behaviors. In the old days, they only saw the third part of this definition, and they didn't understand the first and the second part, because to understand the first and the second part of this definition, we have to understand the physiology behind this disease. Next. So a disease is essentially a defect in an organ system that produces a consistent pattern of signs and symptoms. That's the definition of the disease. So if you think of heart disease, if you think of kidney disease, and basically these diseases have a certain patterns and signs and symptoms that defines that disease, right? And so same with addiction. Next. Our old medical director put this one in. It is an evil disease. But the problem with this, what disease is not evil, right? Most medical diseases kill if not treated. But the problem with alcoholism and addiction is that it doesn't look like heart disease. It doesn't look like diabetes. It doesn't look like hypertension. And some people in this industry would say that this is a disease of denial. Is a very common term used in treatment facilities. But even today, with what we know about the physiology behind the disease, I would go as far to say it's not really denial. That's just an easy term to use, but it may be a function of our prefrontal cortex of our brain. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So it may be a better term than denial would be impaired insight. Affects genetically susceptible people. And yes, with scientific studies and bench studies and large clinical trials, we do know today that genes are involved. There are people who are genetically predisposed to addiction and alcoholism. But what I want to emphasize is, despite our knowledge of genetics, that does not mean that anyone who has the genetic predisposition to the disease would express that disease. okay? And this disease is highly variable, has a highly variable prognosis, just like any other diseases. So what that means is that if this disease is treated, the prognosis could be pretty good. But if it's not treated, the prognosis is poor and is a chronic relapsing disease, same as many other medical illnesses. So, for example, if an individual has coronary artery disease and suffer a heart attack already, he goes to the doctor, his cardiologist, and the cardiologist recommends certain pharmacologic intervention, medications, change of diet, exercise. Now, if the person follows the cardiologist's directions, he would probably do pretty well. But if he doesn't follow his instructions, chances are pretty good he's going to have another heart attack and perhaps die. So prognosis poor if untreated. This disease is culturally and politically divisive. It challenges our societal values and norms. This is one of the distinctions of addiction and alcoholism, that the addicted person is often judged, unfortunately. And even today, in the 21st century, this still occurs. From a layman's standpoint, from a medical standpoint, and from a political standpoint. Unfortunately, we are doing better across all of these aspects. You know, Caron has been very, very active for a long, long time in influencing the medical community as well as the political community. We work at the local level, the county level, the state level, and the national level to essentially carry the message. Next. So a chronic disease is treated, it's not cured. Again, just think back to a typical medical illness. Once a person has coronary artery disease, they're never going to not have coronary artery disease. It's just a matter of putting it in remission to avoid a relapse of that disease. And the outcome does depend on continuity of care over time. And then there's a genetic component involved. For this talk, I'm going to not talk too much about pharmacogenomics, and because that is a huge, huge topic that I could spend hours on. Next. There are many things that the disease model do explain to us today, but there's still much we do not know. There's a lot of research going on. Those of us at Caron in the medical department, we do stay up on the latest literature. We do have a research program on campus that we partner with University of Pennsylvania, Penn State, and other facilities, and also with NIH. And these studies that you see on the screen right now, these are some very old studies that are actually not bad studies. And but so I'm just going to show you some of these. One of them is the Vietnam study. The Vietnam study was done obviously back in the Vietnam War era. Melly, could you go to the next slide? Yep. And during the Vietnam War, that was a horrendous war. A lot of young men from the United States and other countries went to Southeast Asia in a war that was just horrendous. And many of the soldiers, the U.S. soldiers who went over there, all they want to do is survive the war and come home. And while they're there, they just want to numb. They don't want to feel any of it. They just want to numb, they drink, and many of them got into drugs. And in Southeast Asia, heroin was prevalent. And so in this study, the Vietnam study, they looked at those soldiers who began using intravenous heroin. And then they followed these soldiers when they came back to the States. And what they found in this study was that most of the soldiers who picked up IV heroin in Vietnam, when they came back to the US, they stopped using the drugs. And so the authors of this study concluded Now, drug use is situational, depends on the context of the situation. You take them out of that stressful environment and the drug use stops. Next. This study right here is a rat park study. It's a super famous study. And even though it was done back around the same time as the Vietnam study back in the 70s, it's kind of dated, but there are folks out there who are still using the result of this study in their arguments and incorporating them into their studies. So in this study, essentially, it's looking at environment also, just like the Vietnam study. What they did was they placed a whole bunch of lab rats in two separate groups. And one group of rats, they gave them a good environment. They were able to be with each other. They have food, they have water, they have toys to play with. And then the other half of the rats, they isolated them. They did not get to interact with each other, and they didn't have toys to play with and things like that. And they offered both groups, excuse me, both groups of rats morphine water. And in this study, rats in both groups, the good environment group and the bad environment group, consumed the morphine water, and there were deaths in both groups. Okay, so this study was not conclusive to demonstrate that the rats in the good environment group did better. Yet today, even, I read a study only about maybe 2-3 years ago where the author used the studies, proposed that addiction is situational, that if you just give them good environment, it shouldn't be a problem. So this study is kind of inconclusive. Next. This is the Hyman study. Also another study that has been quoted quite often is a spontaneous remission study. So the author in this study proposes that. Now you see the author, one of them is Wang. That's not me, okay? In this study, the author looked at amount of time since the last use. Okay, so if you could see, let's see on this graph on the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, it's a time in years, and the vertical axis, the y-axis, is cumulative probability of remission. So if you look at these lines from 0, and if you go on in years, the curve flattens out. Okay, so cumulative probability of remission improves. And so the author's conclusion of this study was that just give it time. Just give it time and the addiction will go away. So that's why the title of the study is the Spontaneous Remission Study. Next. So what we can and can't say about these studies, that medical model of addiction, even with peer-reviewed research support, does not explain everything that we need to know today. But today, the scientific evidence is pretty robust. And so we are able to say with confidence what we know today about the physiology of addiction. And not that the medical model today is wrong, but that the study, even today at its best, is still not complete. And one of the examples of that is marijuana study, right? Marijuana is a big topic right now, but the bottom line is research on marijuana and peer-reviewed studies are just insufficient right now. We're not at that point yet. Next. So again, real quick on genetics. Genetic predisposition does account for quite a high percentage of likelihood that the individual will develop addiction. Mallory, I think there's more. Yep. And but but that does not mean that anyone who, again, that does not mean anyone who has genetic predisposition will express that disease. And this has been studied for various substances, almost every substances that I can think of, including cigarettes, right? There's people who are predisposed to addiction to nicotine. So here's another study right here. It's a childhood stress study. This is an ACE study. And the author of this study proposed that a child growing up, if they incurred, I believe, 4 or more of these stressors in growing up, they're more likely to develop alcoholism. So if you could look at these 10 criteria here, they're all stressors: psychological, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, things like this. And next. So the author proposed that a child who meets 4 or more of those ACE criteria have a 7-time greater risk of alcoholism and other medical diseases as well, as you can look on the left side of the screen, including developing heart disease, lung disease, things like that. Next. So we're getting closer to what we all came here to hear about. So what we know today is that earlier I had mentioned, talked a little bit about that word denial. And I said that with what we know today, perhaps a better way to describe denial would be an impaired prefrontal cortex, which leads to an impaired insight into self. So what we're looking at here is a girl from when she was a little girl until a young adult. And on top is her brain. And basically, we're looking at the part of the brain where that the red circle is, which is the prefrontal cortex, our forebrain, okay, which is the part of the brain that is responsible for executive function, higher functioning part of our brain. And human brain is not mature at birth, especially the prefrontal cortex. It typically requires humans, in girls, to be into their early 20s before the prefrontal cortex is fully mature. Now, for boys, they lag behind by quite a few years. Boys' prefrontal cortex do not mature until they're perhaps at about their mid-20s or late 20s. So boys do mature later. Boys are more immature. So next. So addiction is a stress-induced disease. We saw that earlier with the ACE study that the author proposed that a child growing up with 4 or more of those ACE criteria, those stressors, are 7 times more likely to develop alcoholism. And what we know today about the physiology behind addictions is that, yes, it is a stress-induced disease. That's part of it. And I'm going to talk about why stress plays such a big role in addiction and alcoholism. Next. In the ASAM definition, the first part, we said that this was a disease of the brain, reward, motivation, and memory. That was the first part of the definition. And so we're going to talk about this now, to talk about why that is. So we're going to start talking about neurochemistry here, the brain neurochemistry. Next. So that was your brain. So I don't want to ask any of you questions because you're muted and I can't see you. But basically, the last 2 to 3 slides with the brain, the fry egg, it's a demonstration of how our brain works intuitively. Okay. Those of you who are my age, maybe, you remember the old anti-drug commercials that we used to see a lot on TV. back in the 70s and even into the early 80s. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Don't do drugs, right? That commercial. And when I showed those two slides, those people my age, give or take, we remember that commercial just by looking at those slides. We kind of giggle, we laugh, go, yeah, I remember that commercial. That's a very, very powerful demonstration of our brain's ability for recall. So part of addiction has to do with information encoding. That means that we are able to process visual, auditory, sensory information, and our brain will pick and choose what information to encode in our brain. There's an area of the brain that we'll talk about later also that essentially is the library for information for our brain. And some information our brain will store away in long-term memory, and some information only in short-term memory. Those information that our brain determines is not that important, you'll store it away in short-term memory. Like if I meet someone at a party maybe, and the host introduced me to the person and tells me what his name is, chances are pretty good, very shortly, I'm going to forget what that person's name is, okay? Our brain has the ability to encode important information to us. And some of that information includes the information regarding rewards and pleasures. Okay, those information that our brain determines that is super important to us, like maybe our wedding day, the birth of our first child, that experience, our brain will never forget that. Rewarding and pleasurable information, that's what our brain will store. And so as we look inside our brain a little bit closer, what we might see is we have billions and billions of neurons. They're basically brain cells, and there's many, many different kinds of brain cells. And these brain cells are all talking to each other, transmitting messages from one cell to the next, to the next, and to the next, depending on what function needs to happen. Next. So this is what a brain cell might look like if we look at it under electron microscopy. These larger areas that's more defined, those are the cell bodies, okay? And there's all these little tentacles, these stringy tentacles everywhere. And there's also one single big tentacle. And that would be the one on the top there, the kind of a pink red one. That's called the axon. That's called the axon. So there's a body, there's an axon, and there's a whole bunch of little tentacles. And they're not really touching each other, even though it may look like they're touching each other, but they're not touching each other. There's a, between these neurons, there's a gap. There's a gap, a space. It's called the neuronal synapse. Next. So if we look even closer, that's what a synapse looks like. The area there's a gap there with the little, kind of lights in there, that represents the synapse. They're not really touching. So how the messages get passed on from one cell to another is through that gap right there. And something has to go through that gap to serve as a messenger, carrying information from one cell to the next, to the next, and to the next. Next. So in an animated version, this is what it looks like. So there's the red one is one cell, and the yellow one is the cell next to it. And there's a gap in between. The green triangle that you saw floating across the gap onto the other side, they represent neurotransmitters. Essentially, they're messengers. And on the other side, on the yellow side, you see these green V's. They represent receptors. And so the neurotransmitters are messengers. They carry information across the synapse to the other side. They dock into the receptors. They're made for each other. Okay, they're not interchangeable. And we have lots of neurotransmitters in our brain. One of the most familiar one to us, everyone knows, is dopamine, right? Dopamine's a neurotransmitter. It's a very important one. But we also have many different ones: serotonin, norepinephrine, glutamate, for various purposes. And so when every function, every human function requires this process to occur, perhaps in a different region of the body. Okay, so if I want to pick up a pen, my fingers need to grasp the pen. So that means my muscles in my hand and fingers needs to contract and relax to hold the pen. So that's motor function. And this process that we're seeing in front of us occurs in a region of the brain that's responsible for that, responsible for muscle function. That's the motor cortex area on the top of our brain. And so we talked about memories a little while ago, and to develop new memories also requires a process like this, and also having cravings and desires within our brain also requires this. And many other functions also happens as a result of this, this interaction between neurotransmitters and receptors. New proteins are generated. Okay, now when we're talking about addiction, new proteins are generated. There's a protein that's responsible for what's called salience. Okay, and researchers have been looking at this for many, many years. And why this one particular protein is important in addiction is because of salience. And what that means is that our brain has the ability to rank things in its order of importance. Okay, for example, my guess is that most of us, we would put our families at the top, the very, very top of our most important list, most important thing on our list. Okay, maybe followed by our job, by our church, and other things that's not crucial and not quite important, like maybe, the golf game, fishing, that would be lower down on our list of importance. So that's salience. With addiction, because of these changes that occurs and creation of this new protein, and the salience changes, okay? Not because the person wants to change that order of hierarchy, but it's physiologic. The person who's addicted won't even know about this or even think about it. So as addiction progresses to end-stage disease, because of salience and creation of this new protein, now the hierarchy changes. The most important thing in that person's life is not mom and dad anymore. It's not the brother, it's not the sister. They start to go down on the list. And the most important thing would be on top of the slide, the new desires and cravings. Okay, what's going to satiate that? What's going to satisfy that? And for our population, the addicted population, the alcohol, the drugs, is going to eventually secure the top spot on that hierarchy. It's going to be the most important thing in that person's life, as if it's life or death. And I say that because there's a reason why it feels like life or death. And I'll explain that a little bit later. And also it changes the genetic makeup a little bit. Also, it causes certain mutation of genes. Also, it set off chemical reaction that is modulated by electrolyte channels. For example, sodium channels. On that yellow receptor there's two gray line. That represents the electrolyte channels, sodium channels, for example. Next. So essentially, what we're talking about here is these neurotransmitters and the receptors and how they communicate with each other in the midbrain. Okay. If you look at the picture of that brain, in the very center of it, where the, kind of the purple lines are, that is the midbrain. It's called the mesolimbic system. And the mesolimbic system is what we would consider the old primitive brain. And the prefrontal cortex I mentioned earlier, where the girls develop, mature more early. Well, that's the prefrontal cortex. That would be the new brain, the executive functioning brain. Now, the mesolimbic system appears to be the hotbed of addiction, okay? And unfortunately, the mesolimbic system, given that it's the primitive brain, is also our survival brain. It is the part of the brain that keeps us alive. It's that fight or flight area of the brain. Mallory, next. So the midbrain is essential to survival of every mammal, including human beings. And it is responsible for us knowing when to eat, when to take a drink of water, when to sleep, and when to fend off predators, okay? And so this is an area of the brain that becomes activated, and we all heard stories like this. A young mother protecting her baby when she perceives a threat. This mother essentially becomes a lioness, a mother lion protecting her cub. She will get very aggressive. She will get stronger. She will get faster, and she will hurt you if you try to hurt her baby. Okay, that is a function of the mesolimbic system. Now, animals have a very, very developed mesolimbic system as well, just like human beings. And but there's a huge difference between animal mesolimbic system and human mesolimbic system. And with animals, they just need to stay alive. They need to eat, drink, sleep, hunt, and reproduce. That's what they need to do. And humans, we need to do that too. But the human mesolimbic system have evolved to the point where it becomes the center of pleasure. It is an area that allows us to appreciate rewarding and pleasurable experiences. So things like, and that's the reason why human beings, we need to survive and we need to eat food, but we don't just eat food. We appreciate the food. We appreciate the taste of it. And I'm pretty sure animals don't really appreciate what their food tastes like, but humans, we do. We're very picky sometimes, and that's because of our mesolimbic system. Same goes for sexual activities. Animals have sex to reproduce, to procreate. Humans, we do that too, but with humans, we not only do that, but we actually enjoy the act. So that's a function of the mesolimbic system. And so the executive functioning part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, is basically a decision maker. It's also the inhibitory area of the brain. So now you can see that we have this mesolimbic system that keeps us alive, allows us to appreciate rewarding and pleasurable experiences. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, that is the higher functioning brain that gives us good judgment, okay? So in humans, these two areas must modulate each other. So we're not, most of the time, on the average, we're not too good, we're not too bad. We're just kind of even keeled. Next. This slide shows other areas of the brain, and I had mentioned the motor cortex area on top of our brain that's responsible for movement and sensations. We had talked about the mesolimbic system in the middle. There's a visual cortex area, the big yellow area on the back of our head, they're responsible for visual processing and vision. And then there's the pink area on the bottom where it says coordination. That's a cerebellum. That's an area that allows us, it's kind of like the human gyroscope. It allows us to stay balanced on 2 feet, okay? Some of the smaller areas, I hope you could see them. The memory part, you see the green one, the memory part, it's just right below the mesolimbic system, okay? In the area called amygdala. And then there's also pain area, the big kind of a maroon color area right in the middle of the yep, there it is. And so it's kind of peculiar that the pain areas, right, is smack in the middle of the mesolimbic system, the survival area and the addiction area. And well, I'm not going to go into this too much, but those individuals with chronic pain conditions, which I take care of a lot of, when they are when their midbrain's activated and they want to drink, they want to use their drugs, or they're emotionally dysregulated, their pain level will increase, even though from a physiologic standpoint, nothing has changed. So the survival behaviors include need for food, water, is a fight or flight response, is procreation, feeling of, just good warm feelings. Next. So the mesolimbic system and prefrontal cortex must work in conjunction with each other. One affects the other. So the reward system affects the thinking. And the purple lines and the arrow pointing upwards, that is basically representing whatever happens in the mesolimbic system will affect that prefrontal cortex. So many years ago, our medical director likes to call the mesolimbic system as the oh wow area. So anything that will give you that oh wow feeling, well, it's the mesolimbic system has something to do with that. So part of that activation of the mesolimbic system is the dopamine is released, that feel-good chemical. Oftentimes we talk about the runner's high. If you're an avid runner, you know what I'm talking about. They get euphoric when they're running, and then after a while, after they stop, they kind of come down. And so that's because during the run and the exercise, dopamine is released. And dopamine could be released for many reasons, not just healthy exercise, but also from pleasurable experiences. So that includes sex, that includes eating, especially certain types of food, such as high sugar content food, desserts, candy, and high carbohydrate food. All will cause a release of dopamine. And we're talking about substances here. We're talking about alcohol. We're talking about drugs. And alcohol and drugs will do that same thing. And we'll look at it a little bit closer to see how they do that. And other substances are released also. It's not just all about dopamine. It's about norepinephrine, serotonin, the glutamate. So this right here, you can see that glutamate, okay? Glutamate is a neurotransmitter. And if dopamine is what we call the feel-good chemical, a feel-good neurotransmitter, glutamate would be that feel-bad neurotransmitter. So not all neurotransmitters give us that oh wow feeling. Next. So here is one of those super expensive instrumentation that we have today that help us support addiction as a disease, okay? So this is a PET scan, positive scan, electron scanning here, positron electron scanning. So this basically is the test subject is a person being exposed to cocaine. Okay, this is a former cocaine user, and these series of slides essentially show the area of activation from the first minute until 30 minutes when this individual was exposed to cocaine. So once the cocaine is in him, after about 10 minutes or so, there's certain areas of his brain that lights up. And that area corresponds to the mesolimbic area, the midbrain that we just been talking about. And then give him a little bit more time, and it just kind of wears off after 30 minutes. Next. So the list you see in front of you all will light that area of the brain up. So on the left side, it looks like they're all substances: alcohol, opioids, cocaine. And you can also see that nicotine is in there as well. This is certainly not a complete list. And it's only a very, very partial list. So on the right side, what does that look like to you? Yes, it's got food, sugar on there. It's got exercise we talked about. It's got sex we talked about, codependency. And on the bottom, there's rage, violence. So that column, I like to call it the feelings column. Okay, on the left is the actual chemical column. On the right is the feelings column. And the reason I say that is it's all about feelings, both left and right columns. It's all about changing the way a person feels from one moment to the next, regardless of what they use to change that feeling. And at Caron, we are accustomed to seeing people who come to us and substances is involved. But that does not mean that the column on the right is not involved as well. And because they all serve the same purpose, change the way we feel. Next. Here's another study that demonstrates how that dopamine level rises, okay? So we all know by now that dopamine is a natural euphoric agent. It comes and goes, depends on what we're doing. If we're feeling great, if we're exercising, if we're running, if we're eating, if we're eating carrot cake, dopamine level will rise. And in a very natural way. So it's the natural high. So if you could see in this chart on that left under the food, you see that dopamine spike, okay, at to about 150% above baseline. And then on the right side, there's someone having sex. Again, the dopamine level rises to, looks like about 200% above baseline. Next. So here we have on the right side, we have someone smoking a cigarette, nicotine, and it does increase the dopamine level also. And looks like in this study, it raised that person's dopamine level just a little bit above 200% above baseline. Now look on the top where it says amphetamine. Someone using amphetamine, and look at the y-axis, the vertical axis. The numbers change. The peak of that amphetamine dopamine level is 1,000% above baseline. That is not natural. Human beings cannot generate that level of dopamine naturally. And look how quickly it happened. Okay, it happened very quickly on the x-axis on the bottom. Those are 0, 1, 2, 3. That's in hours. The amphetamine peaked to 1,000% above baseline in 1 hour. Next. So the answer to this question becomes pretty clear now. People use drugs because they like the effect produced by that substance. And the feeling change that they experience, it just depends on the individual. Some people prefer the more stimulating type of drugs, such as methamphetamine, cocaine. crack cocaine, and some people, like prescription Adderall, Ritalin, things like that. Just it gives them that euphoric energy, and some people just like to trip. In the middle, I believe that represents something like ecstasy, MDMA, and some people just like to just kind of fall asleep. Very relaxed, and it just depends on what feelings people are looking for, what is pleasurable to them. Next. So liking that feeling, for those people who might be predisposed to addiction, becomes needing that feeling. Okay, and there's a reason for that when like become a need. Now, someone who may not have a predisposition for addiction, they may continue to just enjoy that feeling. Not everyone who use even illicit substances are addicts. Some people kind of use it recreationally and they stop, and they could stop pretty much indefinitely until the next party comes along, and then it's available, so they use some and then they go home. And but some people, once exposed, something happens in their brains. So liking it becomes needing it. Next. So the reason for that change, okay, even for someone who has a predisposition, genetic predisposition to addiction, earlier I say even this population may not express the addiction, but once exposed and continue to be exposed, they become addicted. Liking it, it becomes needing it. And that is a function of brain plasticity. Our brain goes through neuroadaptive changes. And neuroplasticity has been around for a long, long time. Researchers, scientists have been looking at neuroplasticity for many, many years, not necessarily as it pertains to addiction, but in people with epilepsy has been studied pretty extensively. So what that means is that our brain adapts to current condition, okay, experience. And as the brain is repetitively exposed to a certain condition, things start to change in the brain. Those brain cells we talked about, those neurons, they change. And they start to, in this field, we like to call them rewiring. Those tentacles that you saw in that slide, they start to change and adapt. They don't stay the same. And so that's the neuroadaptive changes. They start to change, move around, reconfigure themselves to adapt to the condition, the current condition. So if the current condition is use of 2 bundles of heroin per day, that's the way the brain's going to encode the information and adapt. It's going to adapt to that person using 2 bundles of heroin per day, or drinking a pint of vodka a day. Next. So if we look at how the brain, both the non-addicted brain and the addicted brain, respond to a substance, an external stimuli, this is representing that non-addicted brain. Someone who just using substances recreationally, but they could put it down and never use it again for a long time. So every time this person uses, his brain is activated. He feels whatever that is he's feeling, that euphoric feeling. And every time he uses, you could see that the peak is always the same. He experiences the same thing every time. So there's no persisting brain changes. And every time he gets done using, he goes back to the baseline. Next. So this is a graph representing someone who's developed tolerance to a substance. In the very first peak, the green peak, the person uses and he feels exactly what he wanted to feel, that very euphoric feeling. And then when he finishes, it goes back to baseline. The subsequent users, you could see that the peaks becomes lower and lower and lower. Okay, he's not feeling what he used to feel. He's not getting high like he used to get high. He can't seem to become more as intoxicated as he would like to be, drinking 1 pint of vodka a day. And so what does he do? That person will use more and more frequently. If 1 pint of vodka a day is not enough anymore, well, he's gonna, go up to a quart, go up to a liter, and instead of drinking every few days in a binge-like pattern, he may start to drink in that amount every day. And again, what's predictable is tolerance. It's a physiologic phenomenon. And over time, the same pattern will occur again. Now, this will apply to someone who is not addicted as well. This is just purely physiologic. Next. So this is what happens to an addicted brain. After periods of use, increased use, greater frequency, now you look what happened. When he stops using, the brain does not go back to baseline. It goes below the baseline value, okay? And so the peak represents what he's looking for, that pleasurable feeling, that change of feeling, and the very bottom is that's below baseline. And next. So by now, those brain cell has rewired itself. It has adapted to this condition that we're looking at right here. The genes are making new proteins that I mentioned before. Oh, by the way, I don't think I mentioned what the name of that protein is. The protein name is called delta phosphate. Okay, and the brain chemistry is changing, and so now, because of mutation in genes, higher presence of delta phosphate. Right now, this particular person, mom and dad, are not important anymore. Don't want to talk to them, don't want to have anything to do with them. The only thing that's important is, how do I get my peak back to that big one right there? How do I get there again? So now the cravings and the obsession occurs. And again, the only guarantee here, because again, it's physiologic, it's predictable, the pattern of this declining pattern is very predictable. And you can see what happens towards the end. And this is usually about the time when we see people come into our facility. At the very end, no matter how much they're drinking or using, they can't even reach the baseline anymore. All they're trying to do is to not go into withdrawal. They're not even feeling any pleasure anymore. So now they're in this region of absolute profound misery. Okay, they're using to avoid withdrawal symptoms, or just sort of stay normal, which is not really normal, but in their mind, it's normal. So this area of profound misery is not just misery, it's profound misery. This is an area of the brain that we humans should not be at. Okay, humans were not designed to live in this region of misery. And when human brain gets to that region of misery, the one thing that we have a tendency to want to do is to end it, to end that misery. It's that awful. And so a lot of completed suicide occurs in this area, those who don't make it to treatment. Next. So an addicted person, once used for pleasures and rewards, now just used out of desperation to feel that normal, they're normal. So, so with the neuroadaptive mechanism that we have in our brain, the brain will adapt to current condition. And so when a person is in stage disease, their use is so far gone that that they either going to hurt themselves or they agree to come to treatment because they're that miserable. And the brain will continue to adapt. So in their sobriety, the brain will adapt to that condition as well. Okay, the brain just keeps changing. So if a person successfully completes treatment, they stay clean and sober in recovery, their brain continues to change. Those brain cells, the dendrites, the axons, they will just rewire again to adapt to a new condition of sobriety. But the one thing that will never go away, never ever go away, is that memory of prior rewards and pleasures. Remember, I said that our brain is pretty good at encoding information, especially those useful information or pleasurable and rewarding information. I have never forgotten the day my firstborn child was birthed at the hospital. I remember that day very well. And unless I have dementia, I don't think I'll ever forget that. So our brain has encoded memories of drug use and alcohol use because it did something for that person that they're looking for, that's important to them, that's rewarding and pleasurable. So just like the cocaine user in the PET scan example, that any future cues that reminds them and allow for the information in the amygdala to be essentially opened up, okay, just like the brain and the fried egg picture, and could trigger that area of the brain. And when that area of the brain, the mesolimbic area, is activated, even totally free of mood-altering substances, the person's body may not contain that substance, but certainly the cravings and the obsession will come, okay? Because that is the function of the prefrontal cortex. So, we call these kind of cues triggers. And I'm sure many of you have heard that before, that especially individuals in their early recovery should avoid triggers. And so here we see football. And for many people, watching football is one of their favorite pastime. And there's nothing wrong with watching football. I love football too. But many people, when they watch football, that experience also comes with a bottle in their hand or drink in their hand. And some people go as far as using drugs while they're watching football. And so in earliest sobriety, especially, nothing wrong with watching football, but that may serve as a trigger. Next. So the prefrontal cortex, that executive functioning part of the brain, it integrates sensory and emotional information. Essentially, think of the prefrontal cortex as the computer chip, the processor that takes in all the information, crunches the data, and makes sense of it, and assigns salience to the stimuli, assigns importance. Is the decision-making part of our brain, responsible also for motivation, and it inhibits inappropriate or risky behaviors. And the prefrontal cortex does that very well. And a real quick example of that is even someone who's a non-alcoholic, non-addicted person goes out, celebrate an event with his friends, had a few to drink at the bar, and before you know it, he's making a fool of himself. He's taking his shirt off, he's dancing on the table. So that's an example of that inhibitory response. And then once he sobers up and he goes, oh my gosh, what did I do? And so it's also the prefrontal cortex also has to do with personality expression and empathy, has to do with our ability to empathize with others, to develop insight, that's self-awareness, also called metacognition, okay? And when someone, oftentimes I hear family members say that their loved one is in denial. They're not owning up to what they're doing. And I'm thinking, well, that may not be that may not be totally true, but maybe because they're so impaired that they lack self-awareness. They cannot see beyond themselves because their prefrontal cortex is impaired. Next. So the second part of the ASAM definition is dysfunction in these circuits, and these circuits meaning what we just talked about in the mesolimbic system, leads to the characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. Next. So in the psychosocial aspect of this is inability to abstain from substances, because now the prefrontal cortex is involved. The limbic system tells that person, yes, do it again, do it again. It feels great. Don't you want that feeling again? And the prefrontal cortex is also now involved and impaired. There's impaired behavioral control. There's cravings or obsession of the mind, and there's diminished recognition of problems with one's behavior. So now at this point, the person has lost that ability for solid insight and how he's affecting others around him. He does not recognize how much mom and dad are hurting, and because he can't see beyond himself. And there's a dysfunctional emotional response attached to all that. Next. In the spiritual manifestations, basically the person now has a very distorted thought process, again, because the prefrontal cortex is impaired. And so the idea that, Caron treatment centers and many other treatment centers like us, we encourage people to connect with something beyond themselves, a higher power, something greater, perhaps their childhood religion, but they can't even wrap their head around that idea, again, because this aspect of appreciating the meaning and purpose of something greater than self, it requires a fully functioning prefrontal cortex. Next. So all areas of life are affected. And to the addicted individual, he may not see all these things, but certainly we could, right? Those of you, family of the loved ones who are addicted, you could see all these aspects that is on the slide right now. It's not just their health deteriorating, not just legal issues because they've been arrested and charged with DUI, not just the finances. They're wasting a lot of money on alcohol, on drugs. They're losing their jobs. They're affecting those loved ones around them, family members, loved ones, friends, and also now they're starting to look more and more like a psychiatric patient. So now their mental health is affected. They're depressed, they're anxious, they act like they have bipolar affective disorder. Some could be suicidal. Next. So that's why, Caron, we believe that addiction is a family disease. It does not involve just the addicted person. It involves the family. The families are concerned. They're worried, and they're angry. They're frustrated, and we always endorse having a robust family program to get the families involved, because not just for education and understanding, but also to help the family members out, because anger, frustration, resentment, worry, these are sort of feelings as well. And again, human beings, we don't like negative feelings. So even family members will resort to something that'll dampen those negative feelings, including just, eating more dessert, binge eating, shopping, exercise, and some family members will actually resort to substances as well. Next. The third part of this definition is this reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and or relief by substance use and other behaviors. So this is the end-stage disease. This is what Benjamin Rush and Dr. Silkworth sees, and that's what they describe. So even in the newly sober individual successfully completed treatment, the brain function does not go back to normal right away. It takes a while to get back to normal, okay? And in the meantime, there still might be some cravings. There's still obsession of the mind regarding their substances. And but when the individual remain abstinent from their mood-altering substances, they may just reach out to this feelings column to get what they need. They start to eat more, they gain weight, they start to eat a lot of sugar, they start to hook up with the opposite sex. And that's what we call it at Caron. We call it wired up or hooked up. And because it does change the neurotransmitters in the brain. And so in other words, kind of replacing these feelings column activities with the drug column. Next. So the midbrain, the mesolimbic system, has impacted the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is impaired. There's a lack of insight. There's also a lack of braking. So whatever the mesolimbic system wants to do, like pursue the opposite sex for an early sobriety relationship, or to buy a new car to feel better, or to go binge on sweets. Those are function of the mesolimbic system, and the prefrontal cortex is not back to normal yet. So the brake is still not working. And so in early sobriety, it's a very tenuous period. The person's trying to stay sober and clean. They're trying to follow their aftercare recommendations, doing everything that they're supposed to do correctly, and yet their brain is telling them something else because the prefrontal cortex is not back to normal yet. Next. So once addiction is established, other substances which would stimulate that reward pathway may just satisfy the cravings or stimulate them, okay? So oftentimes people begin smoking cigarettes again. Again, cigarettes offer that little bit of the comfort, a little bit of that dopamine rise to make the person feel better. Next. So the brain change does persist. However, it does go back. Next slide, Mallory. So, go back to the last slide. Yep, that one. Yep. So we saw the slide when the peaks are at the very bottom, okay, below the normal, and you see this red line that looks like it's climbing back up to the baseline. Well, that's the post-use level, okay? Typically when people come into Caron Treatment Center, that's where they shift from the green line to the red line, and the brain start to start to normalize, okay? Now, eventually it will get back up to this normal line. How long it takes, no one knows. No one has that information. But regardless of how long it takes for brain function to return to baseline, most people do feel better physically and emotionally. They feel better. They not quite as anxious, not quite as depressed. They could sleep better now. And but how long it takes for actual brain function to go back, there is no data on that. And so this period of time, for some people, they could still feel kind of under the weather, kind of awful, downright awful. And they could still be a little restless, a little jittery. They may still be going through some residual withdrawal symptoms, more commonly from opioids and sedatives like benzodiazepines. And some of these symptoms that they could experience because they may still have that brain fog. They still can't think straight. They're still kind of moody a little bit. The mood They're smooth strings. 1 minute they're, fairly reasonably happy. Next minute they're in tears. Still can't sleep, can't fall asleep, can't stay asleep. There's still cravings. I wish I could use. Can't handle stress very well. Oh my gosh, you should have heard the phone call I had with my wife last night. It was horrible. They can't handle stress very well. So these type of persistent brain changes for some substances do last quite a while. And again, going back to that PET scan of the cocaine user, go ahead and next slide, and the next one also. So on the very top, we see mostly yellow. That's someone who has perhaps just finished using cocaine, okay? Many areas of the brain are activated or lit up. And so the next one would be the one slides on the very bottom. Those are kind of backward. So the next one, on the bottom one would be the next one. The 10 days out, you see that the yellow areas becoming fewer. There's still quite a few areas that's lit up in yellow. And then the middle row slices, that should be 100 days out. Even after 100 days out from his last use of cocaine, he's not completely back to baseline. There's still just a few areas that's still activated. So it does take time. Next. So the next several slides now. Oh, it's 8:20 already. Okay, so basically the remainder of the slides has to do with MAT. So I'm going to kind of skip that. This is medication, primarily what we call MAT, medication assisted treatment, in early sobriety to reduce cravings perhaps, and to hopefully prevent relapse. Okay, so that's MAT, and this is federally endorsed. And here at Caron, we endorse use of MAT as well, because even especially today, with very, very powerful, deadly drugs out on the streets, used to be just heroin. Heroin's natural, comes from poppies, and here comes fentanyl of all different varieties and different strength. And now we start to see people dying. And now it's even more powerful. Now we practically never hear about heroin, even though people are still buying what they think is heroin, but it's all fentanyl and it's killing people. And so, Caron, we do endorse medication-assisted treatment, especially for those who are opioid users, just so that they would stay alive long enough to achieve a recovery. And because, like I said earlier, the brain does not go back to normal right away. So early recovery still plagued with a lot of obsession to use, a lot of cravings. Even if they don't want to use again, their brain tells them differently. And so relapse is something that is we at Caron really, really want to help people avoid. And so MAT is part of that strategy. So abstinence is a must. It's got to be the start of this healing process of this spiritual journey of recovery, and brain will change. And again, I'm all about human physiology and pharmacology. Brain will change. That part is predictable. How long it would take, no one knows. All right, so Mallory, I think what we'll do now is just allow for some questions. I just kind of got carried away with
No problem. Let me stop recording.